In the parish of Mannerton near Widdicombe-on-the-Moor, while some men were removing some accumulations of whey soil a few days since, they discovered what appeared to be a grave. On further investigation, they found the skeleton of a body, which proved from inquiry to be the remains of Anne J., a woman who hung herself some 3 generations since in a barn at a place called Forder, and was buried at 4 Cross Lane, according to the custom of that enlightened age. The North Devon Journal, Thursday, the 23rd of January, 1851. I was recently invited by filmmaker and fellow YouTuber Paul Whitewick to do a collaboration on Crossroad graves. I've touched very briefly on old Crossroad practices in a couple of my previous videos, and so I was both very honoured to be asked and very keen to get the chance to look into this subject in a little more depth. So I'm here with Paul Whitewick, and Paul, thank you so much for inviting me along today.
A pleasure.
Can you tell me a little bit about Crossroad graves?
So this has been such a really exciting research little project, Crossroad graves. I looked at them years ago, and they're just fascinating areas of the landscape, which is away from the community, away from the parish, and often on literally a crossroad.
Yeah.
And that crossroad would nearly always be on a parish boundary, but also with another major route. So many of these are on a point where a parish boundary crosses with a Roman road, for example. There's a good half dozen of these, and they're grave sites associated with let's call it a criminal. We wouldn't use that now for sure, but the crime was against oneself.
Now, YouTube doesn't always appreciate the most well-known term for this, so let me explain. A crime against oneself, or felo de se, as it's known in Latin, was the common law term for taking one's own life.
So the idea being that the person in question the body couldn't settle, I guess, within the parish. It would be well outside of it on this crossroads.
Both in church teaching and law at the time, this was a grave sin, a crime, and those who committed that crime were not permitted to be buried in a churchyard. They were, however, often buried at a crossroads. But why? While Paul focuses on another element of crossroad graves, in this video, I'm going to be looking at the beliefs behind them and trying to answer that question. I'll be visiting one of the most famous crossroad graves in the UK and also looking at a notorious event that once shook the streets of London. A crime against oneself has its roots in the Bible. It states that each person is made in the image and likeness of God. And in the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not kill, or more reliably, murder, is the 6th commandment. Early church father Augustine of Hippo, who lived during the 4th and the 5th centuries, argued that to take one's own life was in fact to break this commandment, that only God himself should be able to take life. From what I could find, the first mention of people being denied a Christian burial in England for this reason comes from the 8th century, from Archbishop Egbert of York in the Penitentials of Egbert. And Thomas Aquinas, writing in the 13th century, further solidified and expanded this stance in his Summa Theologica. So, according to the medieval church, we have what's considered a crime against oneself and against God, a crime for which there is no chance of repentance. These people were considered unforgiven and unholy, and therefore they were not permitted to be buried in a churchyard, which was consecrated ground. To be consecrated is to be made holy, and there's no room there for the unholy. So this gives us a bit of a background into why people who committed this crime were not buried in a churchyard. However, what it doesn't tell us is why they were buried at a crossroads. In trying to get to the bottom of the why, I discovered that it was often believed that the spirits of those who were unforgiven were destined to wander restlessly, and that it was feared that in their wandering they would seek out the living to haunt them. Many scholars write about this, and whilst I wasn't able to view most of the sources they mentioned due to a paywall, I did find this. William of Newburgh, writing in his History of English Affairs in the late 12th century, records a couple of very interesting accounts of alleged hauntings. In the first, a gentleman comes back to haunt his wife and companions. The family, in a state of understandable unease, seek the help of the church, who call a meeting to discuss how to proceed. For some, this man's body should be burnt. As they say, this is not the first time this has happened in England. However, the bishop wasn't very keen on this idea, so he writes a declaration of absolution and sends his men off to see what state the body is in. On discovering that the body is uncorrupted, i.e., it hasn't decomposed, they lay the letter absolving the man of his sins on the man's chest and cover him back up. The hauntings cease. Much like this first account, the next one also includes a man who comes back from the dead. This man, William records, is a great rogue. However, this time, those who dig the body up do in fact put it to the flame, and again, the hauntings cease. So, the people of the day, they have a crime, they have a ghost, but what are they going to do about it? Well, they're going to bury them at the furthest reaches of the parish or the settlement, a place that is considered to be a place between places, a place neither here nor there, a place where criminals are punished on the gibbet, and a place that is often associated with the devil. That place is the Crossroads. According to folklore, a crossroads was the perfect place to bury a criminal. It was believed that their spirit would be confused by the paths and not be able to find its way back to haunt the living. Now, this doesn't sound very biblical to me. I don't recall there being anything in the Bible about wandering, restless spirits of the dead haunting the living or being sent to the crossroads. So where does this come from? I have a theory. Is it possible that these ideas could have been inspired by pre-Christian beliefs that had remained in the folk memory of the people of the British Isles? Now bear with me for a moment, because before we look at Britain, we're going to have to go a little bit further afield. University lecturer S.I. Johnston, when writing about the significance of the crossroad in Greek and Roman beliefs, says this: Greek and Roman authors describe a variety of rituals or superstitions connected with crossroads. At the time of the new moon, suppers were taken to the images of Hecate found at crossroads. The corpses of those polluted by certain crimes were thrown onto the crossroads and stoned or burned. Another scholar writes of Hecate. She was represented as haunting crossways and graves, with the spirits of the dead. Hecate was known as the chief goddess presiding over magic and spells. Pillars called Hecatea stood at crossroads and doorways, perhaps because they were believed to keep away evil spirits. But Hecate was worshipped by the ancient Greeks, so how does this relate to the British Isles? Both Hecate and the Roman goddess Diana shared the epithet of Trivia, which means of the three ways. Like Hecate, Diana shared many of the same attributes, and she even had a temple at a crossroads near Rome, the Temple of Nemi. Here in the UK, an altar with an inscription to Diana was found at the ruins of Trimontium in Scotland. So we know that a small number of people did worship her there. Is it possible that these ideas about crossroads made their way across the border or were already circulating in other Roman settlements within the UK? But it's not just the Romans. These lands were inhabited long before the Romans got here. And one of the things that I kept encountering whilst I was doing my research is this idea of fairies, shapeshifters, and mischievous spirits inhabiting the liminal spaces of these lands. And if these beliefs did exist back then, crossroads were seen as a liminal space, so it would stand to reason that perhaps they too would be thought to be inhabited by these beings. Unfortunately, the evidence for this is quite difficult to find because there was nothing written down really back then, so we only really have word of mouth. to kind of appeal to for this information. But certainly these tales do feel like they are very old. The church had its part in denying criminals burial within consecrated ground. However, wandering spirits and burials at Crossroads were not part of official church doctrine, even if perhaps some clergy took part in this. So could it be that what we're seeing with Crossroad graves are elements of both Christian beliefs passed down from the church and those of an earlier time passed down through the folk memory of the lay people? Wherever these beliefs come from, the thought of having to deal with both the nature of the death and the loss, on top of having to deal with a crossroad burial for a loved one, is not a nice thought by any stretch. And I can't begin to imagine the effect this would have had on any family members or friends. Whilst out filming for our videos, our thoughts turned to this. So Paul and I have just left a crossroad grave, and we were talking about how it can be really easy for us when we're filming to just get totally lost in the moment and completely forget the sensitive nature of what it is that we're filming, and the fact that actually possibly there's somebody buried back there. And it really, I think sometimes you just have to sort of stop yourself and start thinking about it, because it can be easy just to carry on with the filming. What do you think, Paul?
Yeah, completely. It really is. You're making the videos all the time. You're constantly thinking, oh, I need to go and film there. I need to go and film there. I need to go and film there. And you do tend to forget the nature of what you're doing. Yeah, we've just been looking at a long barrow. Well, that long barrow was there for a very clear and obvious reason. It was hugely socially important to this group of people. Who was buried in it? Who knows? We'll never know, obviously. But you kind of think it's such a tangible thing right there. That's probably 5,500 years old. Yeah. But that was the most important thing in the world to a group of people, that they monumentalised a person or a family or a lineage or something. But when you think of, like, goodness me, it's not, we can't feel it because we're 5,000 years on, but they built that for such a massive reason, and as you say, the one we just visited, the Crossroad grave, well, that's even sadder in some ways, isn't it? Because the nature of that grave and the person that was placed there, definitely, it makes you really think. And I certainly don't appreciate enough the things I'm looking at, perhaps. But it's all part of the nature of doing it, isn't it, I guess. It is. But you're right. We should sort of stop sometimes and have a little moment. And have a little moment. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Whilst researching for this video, I discovered that one of the most famous crossroad graves in the UK is not actually all that far from me. So I took the opportunity to drive down to Dartmoor National Park in Devon to go and visit it. This is known as Jay's grave, and it looks like I'm not the only visitor to this grave today. It sits at a Y-shaped crossroads in the parish of Manton, not too far from Widdicombe in the Moor. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because at the start of this video I read out a news report from 1851 detailing how some men had found the skeleton of a young woman on this spot. History records that shortly after this, she was placed in a box and reburied in the same place. According to local law, Kitty Jay was a youthful, unmarried housemaid. Heartbroken, having been betrayed by her lover, she tragically took her own life with a rope in a farm building not too far from here. The news report is the earliest source we have about this grave. Written about 75 to 90 years after this young lady was buried, it records her name as Anne Jay. Sadly, I was unable to access any of the other sources which are said to document this grave. But if these sources are accurately recorded, in them her name changes quite a bit over time. From Anne J, K, Betty K to Kitty J. And on the first map marking her grave in 1905, it's called Jane's grave. On every map since, however, it's been recorded as Jay's grave.
The early accounts don't actually record the reason she ended her life prematurely, so these have either been added in more recent years as people try to make sense of it, or perhaps they are indeed echoes of a community memory passed down from generation to generation. On top of the grave are some fresh flowers.
One of the things that I kept reading every time I researched the grave of Kitty J was that there are always fresh flowers on the grave. It doesn't matter what time of year it is, there are always fresh flowers, and no one ever sees anybody put them there.
The legend of the flowers that seemingly appear out of nowhere is again not in the earlier sources, and my research suggests that Jay's grave has been visited by the curious and the empathetic for around 100 years. So in all honesty, to me, this is not rocket science. I don't believe there is anything otherworldly going on here, only that men and women, having heard the sad case of Anne J or Kitty J or whoever this young lady was, and recognising the despair that she must have felt in her life, have come to a rural location on a moor to quietly pay their respects. We only have a few details about her life, and yet her memory will likely live on for many years to come. Another well-known account of a Crossroad grave is that of the alleged murderer, John Williams. John was the accused villain in the notorious Ratcliffe Highway murders in London in December of 1811. He was arrested for the murders of 7 victims and was due to go on trial. According to the records, however, before he could be tried, he vacated this life of his own accord and was found hanging with a scarf around his neck. This news report documents in vivid detail the day that John was carted to the hole in the ground where his body would be placed, and the huge crowd that gathered to watch. His body, laying on a cart, was wheeled along Ratcliffe Highway. The weapons he used in the crime and the stake that would be driven through his body at his burial lay there with him. The wooden stake served as both a final humiliation for the criminal and an extra layer of imprisonment for his restless spirit. The cart was taken to the 2 homes of those who had been murdered and was stopped outside each for 15 minutes. The news report reads, "A burst of indignation and horror was heard from the multitude. It then advanced into Ratcliffe Highway again and turning to the left, passed slowly on till it came to Cannon Street, up which it went, and finally stopped in the centre of the Crossroads. Within 6 feet of the lamppost, at the corner of Cannon Street Road, furthest from the turnpike, a hole 5 feet long and as many deep had already been dug, and towards this the cart now moved. As the body approached, a murmur of contempt and execration was heard from all quarters, which rose to a shriek of satisfaction when 2 men mounted the platform and unceremoniously hurled the remains of the monster, for such only do his deeds pronounce him to be, into his last earthly receptacle. The stake was then handed to the person who was appointed to drive it through the body, which he did with several blows. And it was none other than the murder weapon that was used to drive this stake through the body of John Williams, before the hole was filled in and the street looked just as it had before."
I think it's important to remember that John was never tried in a court of law, and whilst his premature death did deem him guilty in the eyes of his peers, it's not clear whether or not he really did commit these crimes. One thing is certain, though: he had taken his own life, and therefore, in the eyes of the laws of the day, he was guilty of that crime, and he probably still would have been buried at a crossroads.
In 1823, only 12 years after John's death, crossroad burials were officially abolished, and churchyard burials were allowed for those who had ended their own lives prematurely. However, these were only allowed to happen at night and without a Christian service. In stark contrast to the ideas of the past, which often denied consecrated ground under these conditions, modern Christian burial practices reflect a shift towards greater compassion and understanding. While the sorrow of an untimely death remains, the focus has moved away from judgment to pastoral care for the bereaved and a recognition of the complex human experience, especially in light of the deeper knowledge of mental illness. The Christian Church today teaches what the gospel has always been, that our eternal destiny rests solely on the grace of God and what Jesus did on the cross, and not the circumstances of our death. The Gospels record that Jesus told his followers to love God and to love their neighbours as themselves. And thankfully today, I believe our funerary practices for all people reflect that.
Right, so that brings us to the end of my video. Thank you for watching. Before we go, Paul, today we've been looking at Crossroad graves, and we've both been coming at it from a slightly different angle.
Yep.
And one of the places we actually went to was called Alcombe's grave. So tell us, Paul, what is the problem with Alcombe's grave?
Alcombe's grave is a problem because it's bugged me for a long time. Alcombe's grave should be, in my opinion, associated with a crossroad, a parish boundary, an old route. It should be associated with somewhere that was outside, clearly marked outside of a parish or community. And it's not.
Yeah.
It's just plonked there on top of that heath, and we can find no evidence of stuff. And I think it gets associated with other things as time goes on, but it doesn't quite add up. It's a problem. It should be on a crossroad, or it should be on a boundary or something, but it doesn't.
And that's what your video is about, isn't it?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
So please go and check out Paul's video. I will put a link in the description below. Thanks again, and see you next time.